We all know the story of the Titanic, right? A giant ship, a huge iceberg, an epic tragedy. But what if I told you the iceberg wasn't the real villain? What if it was just the final domino to fall? The sinking of the Titanic is actually a story about a chain of failures, one forged link by human error, long before the ship ever touched the icy water. So let's dive in and see exactly how this preventable disaster happened. And that's the big question, isn't it? How does a ship that was hyped as the pinnacle of modern technology, a floating palace that was supposedly unsinkable, end up in one of the most infamous disasters in history? Well, the answer isn't one simple mistake. It's a whole cascade of them, a perfect storm of failures. And it all started with a powerful and very dangerous lie. So, that first link in the chain, it wasn't made of steel at all. It was made of words. It was the incredibly powerful and ultimately deadly myth that the ship itself was invincible. It really all started as marketing fluff. A newspaper in 1911 called the ship practically unsinkable. But you know how these things go. In the public's mind, that one tiny, crucial word of doubt, practically, just evaporated. The myth became fact. And when you believe you're invincible, you start to get complacent. Dangerously complacent. Okay, now look at this number. 1,178. This is where that complacency starts to look terrifying. That's the total number of people who could fit into all 20 of the Titanic's lifeboats. It's a shockingly low number, and the reason why is even more disturbing. There were 2,224 people on that ship. Do the math. That's not even enough space for half of them. And here's the craziest part. This was perfectly legal. The safety regulations at the time were hopelessly outdated. They were based on a ship's weight, not the number of human beings on board. Why? Because no one could even imagine a scenario where a ship this massive would need to be fully evacuated. The unsinkable myth meant everyone thought the ship was the ultimate lifeboat. But this deadly overconfidence wasn't just in the minds of the public and the regulators. It was literally built into the ship's bones, hidden away in the very steel that was supposed to make it so safe. We all imagine the iceberg ripping this huge gash in the side of the ship. But the real weakness was way smaller, way more subtle. It came down to the rivets, the millions of little metal pins holding the steel plates of the hull together. When scientists analyzed pieces of the wreck from the ocean floor, they discovered a shocking compromise. In the central part of the ship, the builders used high-quality steel rivets. But to save time and money, they switched to cheaper, more brittle iron rivets for the bow and the stern. And guess what? The bow is the exact part of the ship that hit the iceberg. Those weaker rivets likely just popped off on impact, letting the seams of the hull open up like a zipper. The ship was literally designed with a weak spot in the worst possible place. And if that wasn't enough, there was another huge flaw. The Titanic famously had 16 watertight compartments, which sounds incredibly safe, right? Well, think of them like an ice cube tray. The walls between the sections don't go all the way to the top. So as the first few compartments at the bow flooded with water and the ship started to dip forward, water just began spilling over the top of each wall into the next compartment, and then the next, and the next. It was a domino effect that made the sinking inevitable. So let's recap. We have a ship people think is invincible, but is actually full of design flaws. Now let's sail it at nearly top speed directly into a massive, well-documented ice field with a crew that might as well have been wearing blindfolds. All day long on April 14th, the warnings just kept coming in over the wireless, one after another. Look at the timeline. Ships were reporting icebergs, growlers, massive fields of ice. The messages were getting more and more urgent. Essentially, every other ship in the area was screaming, "Danger ahead!" So why didn't these critical warnings get to the captain? Well, the reasons are so absurd they're almost hard to believe. First, the lookouts in the crow's nest, the guys whose only job was to spot danger, had no binoculars. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet, and the officer who had the key was transferred to another ship at the last minute and forgot to hand it over. Then, in the wireless room, the operators were so busy sending personal telegrams for the wealthy first-class passengers that the most vital ice warnings were literally put at the bottom of the pile. And this single quote says it all. Just minutes before the collision, the nearby SS Californian sent a final, urgent warning that they were stopped and surrounded by ice. The Titanic's exhausted operator, Jack Phillips, just snapped back this message. He was busy. Passenger convenience and profit had officially become more important than safety. And that brings us to the moment of crisis. The iceberg is finally spotted. A decision has to be made in a matter of seconds. And the most terrifying part of this whole story might be that the correct, trained, instinctual decision was actually the worst possible thing they could have done. 37 seconds. That's it. From the moment the lookout screamed "iceberg right ahead" to the moment of impact, the officers on the bridge had just 37 seconds to try and turn a 46,000-ton object moving at over 25 miles per hour. It's basically an impossible task. First Officer Murdoch did exactly what he was trained to do. He ordered the ship to turn hard and the engines to be thrown into reverse, trying to dodge the iceberg. But that maneuver caused a long, glancing blow that scraped along the side of the hull for 300 feet, opening up 6 of those watertight compartments. The ship was only designed to survive 4. But here's the gut-wrenching irony. If he had made the unthinkable choice to hit the iceberg head-on, the bow would have been crushed, sure. Only 2 or 3 compartments would have flooded. It would have been a horrific crash, but the Titanic would have stayed afloat long enough to be rescued. The instinct to save the ship is precisely what doomed it. With the ship sinking fast, that fatal math of the lifeboats suddenly became a terrifying reality. Survival was no longer about strength or courage. It became a lottery, and the price of your ticket was what determined your odds of winning. These numbers tell a brutal, simple story. If you were in first class, you had a 62% chance of survival. In second class, your odds dropped to 41%. And if you were down in third class, you had a mere 25% chance of making it out alive. Your deck was your destiny. And that famous rule of women and children first, it was applied with total, chaotic inconsistency. The officer on the port, or left side of the ship, interpreted the order as women and children only, and he sent lifeboats away with plenty of empty seats rather than let men on. But on the starboard side, the officer let men board if there were no women and children nearby. This confusion meant that precious, life-saving space was just wasted in the panic. And for so many passengers in third class, the problem was even more basic. They were housed deep down in the belly of the ship, in a confusing maze of corridors. And there were physical gates designed to keep the classes separate during the voyage that now became deadly barriers. Many of them never even reached the top deck to even see a lifeboat. You'd think the chain of failures would finally end there, but there is one last, absolutely haunting chapter to this story. It's the story of a potential rescue ship sitting just over the horizon that saw everything and did absolutely nothing. The SS Californian was so close that its crew could clearly see the lights of the massive Titanic. In fact, they had stopped for the night because the ice was too dense, the very same ice the Titanic had ignored warnings about. And they watched as the Titanic fired white distress rockets into the clear night sky. An officer on the Californian saw the rockets and reported them to his captain, but the captain dismissed them, saying they were probably just company signals, like fireworks for a party. And remember that snippy message from the Titanic's wireless operator? Well, after being told to shut up, the Californian's operator had simply turned off his radio and gone to sleep. Help was right there, but a combination of misunderstanding, professional pride, and pure indifference meant they just sat there and watched as 1,500 people perished in the freezing darkness. In the end, the disaster led to massive changes in maritime safety. More lifeboats, a 24-hour radio watch, the International Ice Patrol. We learned lessons, for sure. But the story of the Titanic endures because it's more than just a shipwreck. It holds up a mirror. It forces us to ask tough questions about our faith in technology, our own arrogance, and what we choose to do when faced with warnings we'd much rather ignore.